Thanks again for having me. I know this is a topic I'm going to try and discuss today that covers a lot of territory, both historically and engaging in economic theory. But since we have a pretty small group here, I want to encourage you to, if you have any questions, raise your hand. Feel free to interrupt me. I'm going to try and show you some documents as well, and we're going to do some fine-grained examination of what they say. So if you have any questions at all during the discussion, feel free to just get my attention. Also try and save some time for questions at the end. But I want to talk to you about the topic of school vouchers. I came to this line of research a little over a year ago when I was working on some other historical material in the history of economic thought pertaining to the public choice movement that emerged in the mid-20th century. It's one of the main contributors to free market, classical liberal, and libertarian analyses of public policy. And one of the lesser known aspects of the public choice movement is several of the leading figures that were involved in it. Milton Friedman, for one, is kind of a grandfather of the movement at the University of Chicago. But then also his fellow future Nobel laureate James Buchanan at the University of Virginia had both weighed into the school vouchers debate at an early point in its history in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and had some very interesting things to say given what was going on historically. What this led me to was an engagement with an emerging literature on school vouchers from its critics. And if you think about how vouchers have been assessed academically from the people that are attacking them, not only academically, but the activists that are attacking them. The thrust of arguments that are made against vouchers in the public arena, at least going back for several decades, have focused on these top three things, what I call the traditional critiques of the voucher system. There are claims that are made that it undermines public finance of education, claims that are made that it would take monies away from public schools and therefore result in the decline in quality, and we can debate these. There's also an economic claim that I'll get into a little bit more that I think is, of the many arguments that come up against vouchers, this one has probably the most currency in terms of being worth debating, even though I'm very much on the pro-voucher side of the argument. But the core of the public discourse around vouchers has been on areas related to these traditional critiques until about 2 or 3 years ago. 2 or 3 years ago, we started seeing another line of attack creeping into the literature on school vouchers. And I have framed this argument broadly under a term, call it the genetic argument. Why? It's tied to some philosophical concepts, but the gist of it asserts that vouchers are historically connected to resistance to segregation, and therefore they're almost tainted in their DNA. It's the genetic claim. By this link that's posited historically to segregation, and therefore attempts to enact them today suffer from the shadow of that taint that's been attached to them. And this has come out of several different quarters. I'll give you an overview of the genetic argument. Basically asserts, and we'll look at the evidence in a moment, it asserts that vouchers emerged after the Brown versus Board decision in 1954. This is, at least historically, in the same time frame that vouchers are being discussed in the first kind of public foray that it makes as a movement. Really, the leading article is written by Milton Friedman in 1955, so it's only a year after the Brown decision. But the connection is claimed that based on timing, that vouchers are used as a mechanism to allow white parents to withdraw their students from schools that are facing court-ordered integration. So a way to sidestep Brown versus Board without actually indulging in now prohibited, now illegal segregationist strictures. And one of the claims that's made, and this is specifically attached to Friedman and Buchanan and some of the early economists that are working on the voucher movement, is they assert that these free marketeers struck a devil's bargain between their own causes on the economic right and the segregationists. Even though they weren't necessarily segregationists themselves, the claim is made that they noticed a political moment to advance vouchers on the backs of the backlash against Brown versus Board. So it's seen as a really opportunistic portrayal. The early voucher theorists that are allegedly complicit, the main one is Milton Friedman, James Buchanan, and then his colleague at the University of Virginia, who's not as well known, but another free marketeer economist by the name of Warren Nutter. And Friedman published a paper in 1955, Buchanan and Nutter in 1959, that are early contributors to the economics of vouchers. So that's the gist of the genetic argument. I'll give you it in their own words. So some of the people that have made these claims, and this is all within the last 2 or 3 years, Randy Weingarten, the president of American Federation of Teachers, has asserted in a very public speech that vouchers are just a more polite cousin of segregation. The Center for American Progress published a report asserting that vouchers have racist origins, and this is filtered into some of the academic literature. So there's an essay by 2 education scholars that asserts that vouchers are steeped in white supremacist ideologies. And then finally, probably the most public display comes from this book that some of you may have encountered or recognized in the last year from Duke University professor Nancy McLean. She's a historian, and she wrote what's really a conspiratorial novel. It's been referred to as a work of historical fiction by her fellow Duke colleague Michael Munger. Several other scholars have critiqued it, myself included, looked at their history, but one of the core claims of her thesis is that these libertarian free market economists in the 1950s came together and saw a chance to advance their voucher agenda of school privatization and devised vouchers as what they considered, quote, a plan they believed could salvage what remained of massive resistance to Brown versus Board while surviving court review. So there's the key claim there, that it's not officially racist in its self-portrayal, but it has racist motives that can be discerned underneath. And what I want to do is dissect the genetic argument and offer some counter evidence for you. So here we go. Milton Friedman, 1955. This is the famous article that sets out vouchers as a theory, as an economic concept. Draws on some older literature. John Stuart Mill in particular had advocated very similar schemes in the 19th century. But Friedman's big plan is the introduction of competition, just as it would operate in any other marketplace, tends to have quality-inducing mechanisms. Why? You give people choice. They seek out better institutions. They seek out better products. They vote with their feet. And that voting with their feet also induces those institutions to be responsive. So the basic gist of the voucher argument is competition. Friedman's paper is very famous for laying out the basic theory behind how a functional voucher system would work. What it's less known for actually appears in a footnote. Although none of those previous speakers, theorists, scholars that I presented as making the genetic argument would admit it, Friedman actually addresses the school desegregation case that's emerging out of Brown versus Board, out of the court system, in an extended footnote to his paper. And I want to give you a quote from that footnote. He basically says that so long as schools are publicly operated, the only choice between them is forced non-segregation and forced segregation. If I must choose between these evils, I would choose the former as the lesser, forced non-segregation. So he's unequivocal that he supports integration throughout the paper. And this is from a very long extended paragraph, but he says we're offering vouchers as a better way than simply having the state coming in and ordering desegregation. So he's very conscious of the fact that there is political backlash. He sees vouchers as a means to basically undermine the existing segregationist structures, but to do so in ways that are consistent with voluntary market choices. He sees the market as a more effective resolution to this problem, this social ill that's been created by the better part of a century's legislation being enforced upon them by the state. So he is very unequivocal that he opposes segregation, though, and he sees vouchers as a mechanism to undermine it. What's the gist of his argument? Well, it implies that vouchers themselves could induce what we would refer to as economists as a Gary Becker non-discriminatory scenario, working out in the competitive mechanism. Gary Becker is another economist that comes out of the University of Chicago, is one of Milton Friedman's students, works with him very intensely in the 1950s. He published a book in 1957 on the economics of discrimination. And Becker's basic argument is that the holding of discriminatory beliefs is uneconomical. It's unprofitable. It's undesirable if you are in the business of making your business functional and work. Why would you alienate a portion of your customer base? So this is a really functional argument that he puts in place for retail, sales, basic economic activity. And Friedman sees in Becker also a mechanism that could be extended to schools. So Friedman's basic prediction is if we open up schools to competition, schools will want to seek out students. And what kind of a school would intentionally self-limit its audience of potential students because of prejudicial racial grounds? Maybe in the short term that would exist, but in the long term, Friedman views the power of persuasion, the power of the ethical case against segregation as working hand in hand with the competitive mechanisms of the market. So he thinks that if you open up schools to competition, we're going to win in the long run and force desegregation through a market mechanism. He's very clear about this from the outset. What I do want to jump into, though, is one of the other types of critiques of Friedman's arguments that emerged very early on in the voucher discussion. It was a friendly critique from another economist, and that's the fellow depicted there, so all of you probably recognize Milton Friedman. The other character here is an economist, political scientist in some respects, by the name of Alberto Hirshman, who wrote a famous book in the early 1970s called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And Hirshman responded to Friedman's argument about competition in vouchers, although he didn't get into the segregation matter. He offers a counter-argument that's famously become referred to as a Hirshman scenario in the academic literature. But a Hirshman scenario basically says that vouchers function on the mechanism of exit, the threat of exit itself. Can induce schools to choose their behavior, to choose how they structure themselves, to attract students, basically, to attract competition from other schools. But exit is disproportionately used by parents who are concerned about the quality of the schools. So the gist of Hirshman's argument is that if you are a parent who attends the PTA meetings, who goes to the local school board and voices concerns, complaints, who regularly calls the principal, who meets with your children's teacher, you're probably going to be the most inclined to exercise that exit option of a voucher if you're dissatisfied with the school, if you're dissatisfied with the process. This is great if you have good, engaged parents, if you have parents that really care about the children's education. Well, what happens when you have parents from households that are struggling, or parents from households that simply don't pay too much attention to their kids' schools, which happens to be much more of a problem in areas where school systems are considered on the verge of failing or considered in decline? You have absentee parents as well that are entered into the equation. Well, these are not parents that go to PTA meetings. These are not parents that go to school boards to voice their concerns. And Hirshman's big insight is that voice is a powerful tool for improving school quality. If you have parents that are active in their schools, that puts internal pressure to improve the product quality of what's delivered, just as much as the exit option would, the competition from vouchers. So Hirshman is concerned about scenarios where you have absentee parents, parents that are not engaged. He says, if this scenario emerges, all the engaged parents will be the first to leave, and what does that leave you with as the remainder of a school system? A school system that is inclined to further decline as it's stripped of its voice-conscientious parents. And if that scenario plays out in the Hirshman story, it accelerates the decline of the public school. So this is a real problem that voucher theorists have to grapple with. I critique it myself. I think there are certain faults in it, but I think it's a substantive argument in ways that some of these others don't hold up. Well, the interesting thing about the Hirshman scenario is it has direct pertinence to the segregation question, and I'm going to invert it on its head. So the Hirshman scenario operates around a basic assumption, and that is that parent voice is necessarily a force for good in schools. Why? Because parents want better schools for their kids. If they go to the PTA meeting, that's the goal that they're seeking. That's the pressure they're bringing to bear. So I'm going to offer a thought experiment. What happens if the parents are not seeking betterment for the school itself? What if the parents have a different goal? In other words, what if the parents are segregationists? and they want to keep certain racial minorities out of their children's school for discriminatory purposes. That's what's going to happen if we invert the Hirshman parameters. So the historical story is, if we assume the parents' goals are not the improvement of the school, but rather a political agenda that has certain toxicity to it, that has certain spillover ills onto other students in the schools. And you can see right there, there's a famous photograph of the anti-integration protesters after Brown versus Board. We know of instances across the country where people actually came together and physically harassed not just parents, but black students that are trying to enter in to an elementary school that's been ordered integrated under the court system. Think about this. Adults screaming and throwing things at 10-year-olds as they're trying to register for school. I'd say that's a social ill. Well, we also know that segregation is maintained in several southern school systems in particular, but pretty much anywhere that's on the books, by political pressure from parents who are invested in this system of segregation. In other words, the people that vote in the school board elections, that go to the PTA, that call their teachers and their principals of their students, that actually participate in campaigning before the school board, are asking the school board to do certain things, and one of those things is keep black students out of the white school. It's a problem of our politics in that era. So, a segregationist parent can basically be treated as a de facto voice actor in the Hirshman scenario, only instead of seeking quality improvement for schools, seeking the exact opposite, seeking to enforce segregation. So what does this imply? If you get the segregationist parents to leave, what happens to the quality of the school? It actually gets better, because you're removing a toxic voice from the pressure situation that's governing school policy. So the departure of a segregationist parent, for any reason whatsoever, should, at least holding all else equal, improve the quality of a public school by removing that pressure to maintain segregation. At least that's the theoretical framework of inverting Hirshman's critique of vouchers. So, it just so happened that I stumbled across a real case of the inverse Hirshman scenario in action in 1959 in Charlottesville, Virginia. And the economists that I mentioned as the early voucher theorists are aware of this scenario. So I'm going to present to you the evidence of what happened. So in 1959, the state of Virginia saw its entire public school system undergo court scrutiny following a 3-year period that was tied to legislation intended to undermine Brown versus Board. This had been promoted by Senator Harry Flood Byrd Sr., a very prominent Democratic official and one of the most outspoken segregationists in the U.S. Senate, but he also ran a political machine at the state level that basically controlled the legislature and the governor's office. And they put forth a series of laws that said if the federal courts are going to order desegregation in a public school in Virginia, well, the state government is going to step in and order the closure of that school. And what they were planning to do with the closure of the school is then they divert money away to what they called private segregation academies and publicly fund them. So you can kind of see where this is going. Well, all of this is struck down in a series of dual court rulings in January and February 1959. And it throws the entire state system into chaos. So one of the emergent kind of middle ground scenarios and proposals that comes out of the wake of these court rulings is the state legislature reconvenes and they decide that there are pressures to resist segregation, but they can no longer enact laws that formalize segregation on racial terms because they're unconstitutional and it's been prevented by the courts. So one of the stopgap measures that kind of tries to bridge the multiple different factions and sides of the pro and anti-segregation debate is a rudimentary school voucher system. It was adopted in 1959. It offered $250 to each student that sought to use a voucher to transfer to any other school in the state. Interesting thing is it had to be adopted on race-neutral grounds. And they write this into the statute. So in other words, if you were a segregationist parent and you didn't like the fact that your school was being integrated, yes, you could absolutely use the voucher. But it also applied in the other scenario. If you are a minority student and you want to transfer from a predominantly black school into a white school, you could also use a voucher. Or you could go to a private school with a voucher as well. So the race neutrality of the statute trumped the segregationist motive that is at least present in some of the support behind it. Now the genetic argument steps in here in a very famous way. This is where some of the activists in the AFT crowd have really tried to hang their case. They point to a notorious scenario that happened in Prince Edward County, Virginia. That's Farmville. It's a little southwest of Richmond. They had a very notorious case that played out there from 1959 to 1964. The county school board, county government got together and said, we're not going to participate in desegregation. So rather than follow the court-ordered directions to admit black students into the majority white public schools, they shut down the entire public school system. And they did so in a really horrendous way. They provided private funding for the white kids to transfer out into private schools, but left the black students, without any option for a full 5-year period. So a really horrendous case of segregation and racism at its worst. The genetic argument crowd on the voucher case says, well, look, Prince Edward County is proving that vouchers are racist in action because they're providing private education for white students. There's only one option of private education for white students, and they've closed the public school, so they're transferring to white private segregation academies, but nonetheless it's claimed to be an exercise in the voucher case. What's missing from that history, though, is while the Prince Edward County government tried to take advantage of this new voucher scheme that the state of Virginia had enacted, they were immediately sued in court by the NAACP. And that court order came down in a lesser-known case called Allen versus Prince Edward County School Board in 1961. And what do you think that court case did? It prohibited the county from having any access whatsoever to the voucher system. So one of the basic genetic argument claims is based on a historical fallacy. What else emerges from this, though? Well, the Virginia Tuition Grant Program. Yeah.
So what happened to the public schools?
Right. So 1961, this is the case that stops them from using vouchers. So the county government got white contributors, private donors, to fund the white academy in place of the vouchers, and then just left the black students hanging until the Supreme Court came in 1964, so 3 years later, and said, look, you've got to stop this. You're violating state laws, you're violating federal laws, this does not proceed any further. And the Supreme Court strikes it down. So they ruled the whole arrangement unconstitutional. But it's a 4-year period, give or take, that they're really kind of in limbo with this. But for the majority of that period, they don't have any access whatsoever to the voucher system. So that's the Prince Edward County story. It's really not so much on the radar of the voucher advocates beyond this court case, though, that strikes it down. It's removed from the voucher discussion very early on in its entirety. But what else happens is the economists are following this development in the legislature very closely. They're aware that a voucher system has been proposed and enacted in Virginia, and they think, hey, this is going to be a test case to see if our theory works. If our theory holds up, competition will induce schools to not only improve their quality, but it'll also undermine segregation. Friedman specifically argued this in 1955. He's aware of what's going on in 1959, and the two economists at the University of Virginia, they get a front row seat to this debate as it plays out. Just so happens that Charlottesville is another case where the school board is resisting desegregation. White majority school board is trying to prohibit black students from registering at white majority schools in the local school system in Charlottesville. But they're stricken down by the court as well. They're facing all sorts of lawsuits and criticism in the public. And in 1959, this again all comes to a bear because of those court cases in Virginia, so they have to revisit their strategy. City of Charlottesville had a very well-connected insider politician on their payroll. This is a fellow by the name of John S. Battle, Jr. You may recognize the name if you know a little bit about Virginia history. His father, John S. Battle, Sr., was the governor of the state, former governor of the state. John Battle Jr. is well connected into the Harry Byrd political machine. He's an aggressive segregationist, and in fact, he is the go-to attorney for local school districts that are fighting the NAACP suits. So he's involved in potentially even, there's probably even dozens of cases across the state of Virginia in resisting school integration. But he's local in Charlottesville, and he's hired by the Charlottesville school system to fight off the NAACP. And he gets creative in kind of a very wicked, evil way, but he gets creative. In 1959, the courts have ruled and affirmed Brown is the law of the land, so they can no longer prohibit black enrollment at white schools, but they can do something else. Battle urges the school board, with the support of segregationist parents on the PTA, to adopt two other policies that enact de facto segregation through roundabout, unofficial ways. One says we can draw the zones around neighborhoods that direct students to certain schools in such ways that just so happen to coincide with racial lines. So we'll zone the black neighborhood to the black school, the white neighborhood to the white school, and never the two shall meet. So that's one of his tactics. But he sees there's a fault in this. What happens if people move? What happens if a black student or a black family moves into a zone that's written on the maps as supporting a white school, as feeding into a white school? Well, so we can stop that as well. We just won't expand our school size, and we'll enact rigorous enrollment caps on the number of students that can enter into the existing public schools. So if this white elementary school has space for only 500 students, we'll just make sure that it is full to the brim and never drops below 500 students. That means there's no room for anyone else to enroll, even if the court is ordering us to enroll new students. So you maintain segregation without having segregation on the books. Really pernicious plan. But Battle recognizes very early on his plan has an Achilles heel. And that Achilles heel is the school voucher system. Problems for Battle? Well, vouchers are used by these parents that I described in the previous scenario, the inverse Hirshman scenario, the parents that are likely to complain about black enrollments in a white school. If it induces them to move their kids to a private school or another school that's not facing integration, they'll leave. What does that do to political support for segregation in the Charlottesville school system? Undermines it, takes them out of the equation. So not only does support for maintaining segregation through these other means decline if the segregationist parents leave on a voucher, it also opens up seats in the classroom. You can no longer maintain the enrollment cap if there are new seats in the classroom, and because of the court order, any student, white or black, or any other racial or ethnic group can register in that school, provided they live in that zone. So it completely undermines, through the execution of the voucher scheme, it's basically like the segregationists are stabbing themselves in the back, is the argument he's making. And he sees this as an existential threat to his new plan that he's laid out to maintain segregation. Actually found archival evidence that this is circulating in the discussion around Charlottesville. Here are two newspaper articles where Battle cautions against move to private schools. This is from kind of the more mainstream newspaper. It was done from the Charlottesville local newspaper. They covered a speech he gave in March of 1959 where he lays out this plan and lays out the existential threat of vouchers that have created to the maintenance of his plan. The kind of more beige-colored older newspaper print, that's actually from a segregationist newspaper known as the Richmond News Leader, that was kind of the full-fledged organ of the Harry Flood Byrd political machine. And they quote Battle's speech in the headline that says, "Private schools, if they're enacted, are going to lead to the engulfment of the public school system by Negroes." So he's ominously holding this over, and it's really nasty language, really overtly over-the-top racist language that he's putting forth in this plan. Battle's speech actually gained some currency. One of the local anti-integration groups teamed up with one of the local public school supporter anti-voucher groups, and they reprinted hundreds of copies of this speech and circulated all around the Shenandoah Valley, kind of the western central Virginia, to other school districts that are facing this. I found it as far south as Lynchburg and as far north as the DC suburbs. Give you an idea on the map of where this has been circulated. So Battle's argument becomes a very public presence. I mentioned that the economists were aware of this argument, or likely aware of this argument. Why? Because Charlottesville is the home of the University of Virginia, where James Buchanan and Warren Nutter are professors on the economics faculty. They're watching this play out in public, not only with Battle's lecture, but also the dissemination of his argument, because in 1960, after the voucher program's adopted in Virginia, Battle's argument, or elements of it, are also picked up by the white teachers' unions, Virginia Education Association. And they start printing elements of it in their literature. So it gets really interesting. Something happens at the University of Virginia. So you have these two voucher advocates on faculty, Buchanan and Nutter, and that's a picture of Buchanan right there in his younger days. They decide that they're going to study this program in action as it's playing out, to see what it does for competition in schools generally, but they're also aware of racial integration. And in the spring of 1960, they invite Milton Friedman from the University of Chicago to come to Charlottesville and give a lecture on his theory of vouchers. Without documentation, this lecture happened. We don't know what was said exactly because that's been lost so far to history. I'll get into some of that documentation in a minute, though, because it shows the anti-segregation position is very present and prominent in Friedman's lecture. But what happens early on in the voucher debate is the VEA, the Virginia Education Association, notices that vouchers are being used for reasons other than escaping school integration, reasons other than parents that want to remove their kids from desegregation. They're finding that parents are moving their kids to a neighboring school district because it has better schools. They're finding parents are moving their kids to a private school because it has better schools. Or maybe it's geographically closer and they live near the county line. Dozens of different reasons that parents are stating when they apply for one of these vouchers of why they'd want to move schools, and very few of them are tied to segregation. And in fact, they're seeing students moving from segregated schools and into schools that are already integrated, that have faced the court order. So it's operating in the reverse direction. Parents are pulling kids out of what they consider a racially toxic, segregated environment and moving them into an integrated environment in some of these school districts. So evidence of this is all over the place. Buchanan and Nutter take notice and they decide to study it. But they bring Friedman to the University of Virginia to give a lecture. I found Milton Friedman's lecture notes. Not the transcript of the speech, but there's Milton Friedman's lecture notes. And I know it's a little bit difficult to see what he's laying out. And this is an excerpt of it. He says, segregation in education. And he's walking through the steps of his argument. He says that this is a means, vouchers are potentially a means of addressing a problem that is not well suited for state enforcement, not well suited for state edicts. But he's very clear that it's a way of sidestepping the enforcement of segregation. So it's a means to avoid either enforced segregation or enforced integration in a way that leads to integration nonetheless as its outcome. But he says there's a dilemma if the state monopolizes this decision, imposes a rule, a one-size-fits-all rule on all schools. We can get out of that dilemma by introducing school choice and using school choice as the mechanism to kind of chip away at segregation from beneath. What gets interesting, though, is on the next page. So he continues his lecture notes. He's walking through his argument. It's basically stating everything that he argued in his 1955 paper with some elaboration. But he gets to this final bullet point. So he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. And what does 5 just say? Virginia. Virginia, period. He thought that the Virginia case was ground zero for testing this theory in action. And all indication, all clues that we have from the lecture is that's probably the argument he was making in 1960 at the University of Virginia. So here's the historical challenge for you. There was a recording made of this lecture. In fact, I verified this recording because in 1961, Milton Friedman wrote a letter to one of the other economists at the University of Virginia, Dr. Leland Yeager, and said, I remember my lecture on education. I also gave a lecture on education that was tape recorded. Can you send me a copy of the tape? I have not found that tape, unfortunately. It's not in Friedman's archives. Leland Yeager actually just passed away a little over a month ago. I was able to talk to him before his death and asked him if he remembered anything about this or had a copy of the tape by chance sitting in his garage. Unfortunately, no. So it's out there somewhere. There is a recording of Milton Friedman's lecture at the University of Virginia arguing an anti-segregation case for school vouchers in 1960 on the ground in Charlottesville, Virginia, amidst this entire environment. So that may be the door shut on the genetic argument if we ever discover that. But nonetheless, we have enough information from around the time to know what Friedman was thinking, including those lecture notes I showed you. It gets more interesting. Remember, the VEA becomes the most vocal seizer of elements of this argument that John Battle had laid out in 1959 while the voucher debate is playing out. Vouchers get enacted, and the Virginia Educators Association, which is the state chapter of the NEA, views vouchers as a threat to public school funding. They strike an alliance with the segregationists, and it's a very public alliance. This is an op-ed written by Robert F. Williams, the director of the Virginia Education Association, in 1961. It's published in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, no small paper, where he's basically arguing that the voucher program is being misused by all these parents that are taking their kids out for non-segregationist reasons. Oh, the horror. And in fact, there's the Richmond Times-Dispatch. They do a study, and they find in 1962 that most tuition grant users sought better education, not segregation, when they were enacting on this. And they actually did some surveys and found some statistics. They also found white and black students are both using the vouchers. They're taking it as percentages of the totals, and they asked the parents, why did you move your kids to other schools? The answer is almost invariably quality. There's another news report from the time. They did a study of the city of Roanoke school system. And out of 156 children that were interviewed receiving pupil scholarships, vouchers, for the grants this year, and that was in 1961, only 5 of the applicants formerly attended the school, a school that had become integrated. So only 5 out of 156 students did so for segregationist reasons, according to this very simple survey that was done. Well, this infuriates the NEA, or the VEA, the state chapter of the NEA, and what do you think they do? They go to the state regulators and say, your program is being misused. You need to enact regulations that prevent parents from using vouchers for any other purpose besides segregation. I'm going to show you one more document that just shows you how far Robert F. Williams and the VEA's argument goes in favor of segregation. As in November 1964, they published in their own in-house journal, the Virginia Journal of Education, a front-page editorial denouncing the voucher system. And I won't read the whole thing, but you can see what they're concerned with. The pupil scholarship program would never have been enacted into law if the General Assembly had not been searching for a way to subsidize private education for those who object to racial integration. They go on rail against it and say it's being abused. It was not the intent to subsidize public education generally, only segregation. So the pupil scholarship is being so greatly abused as to increasingly defeat its original purpose of segregation. Of the 12,181 scholarships issued in 1963-64, 10,776 were used in private schools, many of which were, oh horror, integrated. And they had 1,400 or so were used in public schools, again, many of which were integrated. So they're responding to all these statistics that are starting to appear that are showing people using vouchers for non-segregationist purposes, and they're furious. And the last piece of evidence I'm going to show you. So what do you think the economists are doing when they see the Virginia Journal of Education running this editorial? They take notice. They, in fact, in 1964, published a lengthy legal rebuttal of the VEA's position. They went through court history, and this is a copy. You can see this is a quote of the exact same editorial side by side. In the 1964 issue of the Virginia Journal of Education, quoting Dr. Williams, the director, has his editorial statement that he published side by side. And what Buchanan did, Buchanan was the director that put this report together, is he went through step by step and said, look, the VEA's interpretation is not only bad economics, it's bad law. We can go back to the legislative debates from 1959 and 1960, and we can see that the state stripped out racial requirements for vouchers because they had to. The courts were ordering them to. There was no possible way to pass the law and for it to remain constitutional with the racial restrictions that the VEA wanted at that time. So you have Buchanan's actually making that argument. Interesting thing, this is published in 1964. It completely blows up Nancy McLean's depiction of Buchanan as being complicit in the segregationist scheme. It's quite the opposite. Just like the voucher opponents teaming up with segregationists, you also have the voucher advocates, the economists, that are arguing against this position. So that's very clear in the evidentiary record that they've left us. What does this lead us to in conclusion? Although the voucher scenario in the 1950s and 60s is very complex, it's not perfectly integrated. There are segregationist elements that use it. The scheme itself, at least, is designed and forwarded in a way that intends to enact and take advantage of Milton Friedman's argument of competition. What we see in 1959-64 Virginia represents a real-world example of this inverse Hirshman scenario that we've derived from theoretical economics, very much right down to the case that the departure of segregationist parents undermines the strength of segregation in schools where it already exists, and the introduction of competition continues that undermining. So even though vouchers have a complex relationship to desegregation, the theorists, the people that are the intellectual architects of vouchers themselves, are very much on the desegregationist side. They're very much on the anti-discriminatory side because that's consistent with the market mechanism. Where there is a devil's bargain, it's exactly the opposite of the one that's been posited. It's the teachers' unions, the white teachers' union coming together with the segregationists, and we see that persisting at least until 1964. That's as far as I've traced it. There are probably elements of it on a county level. Why 1964? That's the year that the VEA is basically pushed by the national chapter to integrate itself. So it previously had been an all-white teachers' union. And there are national pressures to start admitting black members into the teachers' union. So they do step away from that, but the voucher argument has already been lost then. What does this leave us in terms of the genetic argument? The genetic arguments against vouchers don't withstand historical scrutiny, including basic scrutiny of the evidentiary record that the economists have left us, that the free market voucher advocates have left us, and that the segregationists have left us on the other side of the issue. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you again.